Hey everyone, this is a piece by Ingo Elbe titled Helmut, Reichelt, and the New Marx Reading. This is from the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. I read this book a while ago, and I thought it was really a tremendous publication event. And I'd like to popularize or make available some of these texts. I would highly recommend anybody interested, not just in the Frankfurt School, but in Marxism, in reading this book. Also, it's kind of skewed. I would argue that it's heavily skewed towards like the other the other second generation of the Frankfurt School. So it has way more space for like people like Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Hans-Georg Bachhaus, Helmut Reichelt, Johannes Ignoli, and Oscar Necht, and Kluge, Alfred Schmidt, Alfred Sohn Reichelt, those kinds of people. The reason I'm listing them off is because they're right in front of me, as opposed to figures like Jürgen Habermas or Axel Honneth. So, let us proceed. I'm going to read the little bio for Ingo Elbe. Ingo Elbe studied philosophy, history, and social psychology at the Ruhr University Bochum and obtained his doctorate in 2008 at the Free University of Berlin for a thesis on the reception of the work of Karl Marx in the Federal Republic. From 2007 to 2012, he was a lecturer at the Institute of Social Sciences at the Technical University of Braunschweig, and from 2011 to 2014 at the University of Applied Sciences, Düsseldorf. In 2015, he completed his habilitation at the Institute of Philosophy of the Karl von Ossietzky University, Oldenburg, with a thesis on paradigms of anonymous rule. Elbe was a visiting professor at the Department of Political Science at Giessen University in the winter semester 2017-2018. Elbe is a lecturer and research assistant at the Institute of Philosophy of the Karl von Ossietzky University, Oldenburg, and chairman of the Bochum Nonprofit Association Institute of Social Theory. Book publications include Marx im Westen, die neue Marx-Lektüre in der Bundesrepublik, published in 2008 in Germany. That's supposed to be a very important book, and I know it was supposed to be translated at some point. I don't know what's the current state of that, but it would be a very big. I would definitely be reading it if and when it does become available in English. Paradigmen einer Herrschaft, politische Philosophie von Hobbes bis Arendt. And of course, it was translated by Jacob Blumenfeld, who wrote a book on Max Stirner, and I think is writing or has written a book recently on property. He also translated, I believe he also translated Zena Arnoldt's book on anti-Semitism in the American left. Guess I should duplicate this so I can have easy access to the endnotes. Duplicate. Okay, the page. Come on now. Hurry up, computer. Alright, here we are. Oh. Here we are. Biography and position in the Frankfurt School tradition. Helmut Reichelt, born in 1939, studied political science in Freiburg from 1959 to 1961, and subsequently in Frankfurt under Theodor W. Adorno and Max Horkheimer, graduating in 1966. Reichelt completed his political science dissertation in 1968, supervised by Irving Fetcher. I have Irving Fetcher's book, Marx and Marxism, on this channel, as well as a couple other essays by Irving Fetcher. I believe Irving Fetcher was also the thesis advisor, the PhD advisor for Moïse Pastone. Anyway, Reichelt completed his political science dissertation in 1968, supervised by Irving Fetcher, among others, and published it in 1970 as On the Logical Structure of the Concept of Capital in Karl Marx. In 1972, Reichelt became professor in Frankfurt, and in 1974, Reichelt received a position at the University of Bremen as chair of, quote, scientific and social theory, with specific focus on dialectics and the critique of political economy. Footnote. Some parts of the following text derive from my book published in German as Marx im Westen. Back to the text, or end footnote. The University of Bremen, founded in 1971, can be regarded as one of the academic centers for the development of Marxist theory in West Germany in the 1970s and 1980s. Alfred Sohn-Rethel, Friedrich Huisken. I think I actually might have a piece by Huisken, because I think he was in I think he had a piece with somebody in the State Derivation Debate book, edited by John Holloway. Friedrich Huisken, Margaret Wert, Heide Gerstenberger. Heide Gerstenberger had a piece in one of the Open Marxism books. She wrote a big fat book called Impersonal Power, which I have yet to read. I have it, but I haven't read it. I got greedy one time. Hans-Jörg Sandkühler, Hans-Georg Kannert, Lothar Peter. Reichelt taught in Bremen until his retirement in 2005. I want to look up some of these people, sorry. I wouldn't do this, but I think it will be enlightening. According to German Wikipedia, Friedrich Huisken is a Marxist publicist and former professor of political economy of education at the Department of Educational Sciences at the University of Bremen. Huisken is the author of the Marxist theory journal Gegenstandpunkt. Gegenstandpunkt Political Quarterly is a Marxist theory magazine from the publishing house of the same name based in Munich. It has been publishing regularly since 1992, as a successor to various publications of the Marxist group, especially the Marxist Streit und Zeitschrift, MSZ. It continues their line in terms of content. The magazine was monitored by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution until 2018 and classified as being under left-wing extremism. His publications include Incitement to Unrest, A Destructive Reader with a Constructive Appendix, published in 1984, Xenophobes and Friends of Foreigners, a polemic against both the outlawed and the respected racism, The Science of Education, Introduction to the Basic Lies of Pedagogy, Neither for School nor for Life, Critique of Education, Part 2, Nothing But Nationalism, German Lessons from Rostock to Moon, an Anti-Racist Diary, Youth Violence, published in 1996, Education and Capitalism, on the Basic Lies of Pedagogy and the Undeniable Benefits of Bourgeois Educational Institutions, published in 1998. On the criticism of the Bremen, quote, brain research, Brain Determines Mind, Errors, Functions, and Consequences, published in 2000. German Lessons from Rostock to Moon, Nothing But Nationalism, published in 2011. Arsonists as Firefighters, The Right-Wing Extremism Campaign, Nothing But Nationalism 2, published in 2001. E.G. Erfurt, What the Bourgeois Education and Imagination System Can Do, published in 2002. The, quote, PISA shock and how to deal with it. How much stupidity does the Republic need/can tolerate? On the Ungovernability of the School Population, published in 2007. The Democratic Womb is Fertile, The Misery of Criticism of Neo-Fascism, published in 2012. Runaway, Stored, Fished Out, Sorted Through, Fended Off, Incorporated, New German Refugee Policy, published in 2016. With Rolf Goethe, Everything Mastered, Nothing Understood, National Socialism in the Classroom, published in 2019. Refugee Talks, 2015, on Democratic Xenophobia and Ethnic Nationalism, Left-Wing Patriotism and Cosmopolitan Patriotism, published in 2020. And Peace, A Critique on Current Occasions, published in 2023. So that's Frerk Huisken. Margaret Wirth was born in 1943 and is a German political scientist and economist. Wirth studied political science, history, and economics in Munich and Berlin. Margaret Wirth was professor of political science at the University of Bremen from 1973 until her retirement in 2006. Margaret Wirth's main areas of work are economic policy, the relationship between state and economy, and Marxism. Margaret Wirth is on the editorial board of the journal Gegenstandpunkt. Her first book of 1972 is titled Capitalism Theory in the GDR. On the function of a critique of bourgeois economics today, in Jürgen Kluwer, Frieder Otto Wolff's edited volume, Critique of Science and Socialist Practice, Consequences for the Student Movement, published in 1973. On the Critique of the Theory of State Monopoly Capitalism in Problems of Class Struggle, 1973. Welfare State Illusion and Current Crisis in Links, Socialist Newspaper, published at the Socialist Office, Offenbach, 1974. Peter von Urtzen, Jörg Hofschmid, Margaret Wirth, Theory and Practice of Direct Democracy, Text and Materials for the Council Discussion, published in 1985. And Margaret Wirth, Wolfgang Mühl, Employment, Globalization, Location, Notes on the Capitalist Relationship Between Work and Wealth. All right, so Heide Gerstenberg we already know. Hans-Jörg Sandkuhler. Hans-Jörg Sandkuhler, born 1940, is a German philosopher and professor emeritus. I'll just read his list of publications. Democracy of Knowledge, Enlightenment, Rationality, Human Rights, and the Necessity of the Possible, published in 1991. History, Social Movement, and Cognitive Process, Studies on the Dialectic of Theory Development in Civil Society, published in 1984. Critique of Representation, Introduction to the Theory of Beliefs, Knowledge, Cultures, and Knowledge, published in 2009. Nature and Cultures of Knowledge, published in 2002. Practical and Historical Consciousness, Study of Materialist Dialectics, Epistemology, and Hermeneutics, published in 1973. The Reality of Knowledge, Historical Introduction to Epistemology and the Theory of Knowledge. Law and State According to Human Dimensions, Introduction to Legal and State Theory from a Human Rights Perspective, published in 2013. And he was the editor of Encyclopedia of Philosophy in 2010. Encyclopedia and Emancipation, The Whole of Knowledge, published in 1988. European Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Science, published in 1990. Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, Philosophical Sketches and Diaries. Handbook of German Idealism, published in 2005. Culture and Symbol, a Handbook of Ernst Cassirer's Philosophy. Thinking About Human Rights in the Future, 60 Years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Philosophy and National Socialism, Philosophy What For? Law and Morality, published in 2010, and Representation and Knowledge Cultures, published in 2007. Hans-Georg Kahnert was born in 1933 and died in 2004, and was a German economist and social scientist and author. He was a professor at the University of Bremen and was part of the inner circle of the Socialist Office. Kahnert was the son of his I don't feel like reading that. Writings. Introduction to the Political Economy of the Federal Republic, Models for Political and Social Science Education, Volume 1, published in 1972. The 1968 Movement, an article from 2004. Introduction to the Political, that's already read that. That's Volume 2. Introduction to the Political Economy of the Federal Republic, Models for Political and Social Science Education, Volume 2. Communism in the Soviet Union, Historical Prerequisites, Changes, Current Structures, and Problems, published 1971. Ecology and Society, an Introduction to the Problem of Man-Nature Society from a Marxist Perspective, published in 1984. The Economics of Impossible Socialism, Crisis and Reform of the Soviet Economy under Gorbachev, published in 1990. Political Economy and Educational Work, published 1997. From Commercial Capital to Globalization, Development and Critique of the Capitalist Economy, published in 1998. The Basic Political Directions Within German Social Democracy Before the First World War, published in 1973. Russia and the Rest of the Soviet Union After the Coup Attempt in August, published in 1991. Reformism and Radicalism in Bremen Social Democracy Before 1914. I think that's where Pannekoek was censored. I'm not sure about that. I might be wrong. Liberalism and Neoliberalism in the World Market, supplement to the journal Sozialismus, published in 2003, and the quote, Consistent Left, Reflections on the Situation, Analysis, and Chances of Intervention. Lothar Peter. I think Lothar Peter wrote the book on the Marburg School, which is like Wolfgang Abendroth and I don't know, was Leo Kofler in that too? I'm not sure. Lothar Peter is a retired professor of sociology at the University of Bremen with a focus on industrial and business sociology and later general sociology. His books include The New Working Class, Technical Intelligence and Trade Unions in Organized Capitalism, published in 1970, Class Struggles in France Today, published in 1972, Literary Intelligence and Class Struggle, quote, The Action, end quote, 1911 to 1932, often associated with council communism. With Peter Henrichs, he wrote Industrial Peace, Industrial Science, Rationalization, and the Workers' Movement in the Weimar Republic. Between Reform Policy and Crisis, Trade Unions in France, 1980 to 1985, published in 1985. With Johannes M. Becker and Frank Deppe, The French Experiment, Dogma or Science, Marxist-Leninist Sociology and the State Socialist System in the GDR, published in 1991. With Christopher Butterwege and the project group Conversion in Business and Society, Armaments Conversion in the Region, Studies on the Conversion Process in the Lower Weser region, published in 1997. With Stephen Moebius, he edited the volume Contemporary French Sociology. And this is the book that I was thinking of. Marx at the University, the quote, Marburg School, History, Problems, Actors, published in 2014. In English, this was Marx on Campus, A Short History of the Marburg School. And he originally wrote that book in 2014. Georg Lukács published Culture, Art, and Political Engagement, 2016. Controversial Modernity, Sociological Discourses and Social Criticism, 2016. Okay, I think we can move on. Sorry, I'll try not to do that too much. I think that probably was irritating to listen to, but I thought it was interesting. Reichelt taught in Bremen until his retirement in 2005. Alongside Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt represents the new reading of Marx, Neue Marx-Lektüre, that developed in West Germany from the mid-1960s onwards. Footnote: Alfred Schmidt, an intermediary between the older critical theory generation and these more recent representatives, occupied himself with methodological questions about Marx's work at the beginning of the 1970s, especially in the context of Louis Althusser's structural Marxism. But Alfred Schmidt, did I say Alfred Schmidt before? For some reason I thought I said, no, I think I said something wrong earlier. But Alfred Schmidt did not subsequently intervene in the specifically Marxological debates. I don't know. For some reason, I feel like I said Alfred Zone-Reitel at the beginning of that, but it's Alfred Schmidt is the correct, what I meant to say. Or ought to have said if I didn't say that. End footnote. This new reading opposed both the Marxist-Leninist and social democratic orthodoxy of Marx, and undertook a comprehensive reconstruction of the object and method of the critique of political economy, at least from the Frankfurt Colloquium on Capital of 1967. Footnote. See Euchner and Schmidt, 1972. The basic thesis concerns the utterly inadequate interpretation of Marx's work, first established by Friedrich Engels and then adopted by party officials and reflected in an empiricist methodology and a value theory indistinguishable from classical economics. Footnote. Engels interprets the different levels of abstraction in the presentation of the laws of the capitalist mode of production and capital as equally important empirical models of historically different modes of production. He therefore thinks that Marx begins his account with a pre-capitalist, neatly arranged, moneyless exchange of commodities according to quantities of clearly evident, quote, abstract, end quote, labor expenditure. For a critique of the notion of for Engels' method here, or Engels' interpretation of Capital Volume 1, check out the piece that I have on this channel, The Myth of Simple Commodity Production, by Chris Arthur. End footnote. Next footnote. See Brentel 1989, Bachhaus 1997, and Bachhaus 1997C. Nevertheless, it was not until the mid-1970s that this critique of traditional Marxism was worked out clearly. Also beginning in the 1970s, Marx's scattered and sometimes contradictory positions on the state and history were subjected to the same effort of critical reconstruction. Beyond the confines of traditional Marxism, Helmut Reichelt took part in all these debates in a more or less decisive manner. Both Reichelt and Bachhaus were students of Adorno, but Reichelt and Bachhaus explicitly distanced themselves from what Reichelt and Bachhaus considered to be his largely superficial reading of Marx and his idea of critical social inquiry, which slipped into civilizational critique. As Peter Rubin notes, the Frankfurt School of the New Marx readings begins, quote, as a self-negation of the cultural critical orientation, end quote, of classical critical theory. God damn it. Wikipedia says Peter Rubin, born 1933, was a German philosopher. He died in 2024. His writings include Mechanics and Dialectics, published in 1969, Contradictions in Natural Dialectics, published in 1975, Dialectics in the Work of Philosophy, 1978, Friedrich Engels and the Philosophical Foundation of Mathematics in 100 Years of Anti-Dühring Marxism Worldview, published in 1978, Philosophy and Mathematics, a popular scientific presentation of the philosophical basis for the ideological understanding of mathematics, published in 1979. Modern Communism and the Social Question, published in 1999. With Hans Christoph Rau, he wrote Experiments in Thought, GDR Philosophy in the 1960s. With Camilla Warnke, he wrote File number 17658, Criminal Case Against Langer et al., a dark chapter in the history of GDR philosophy. And Peter Rubin, collected philosophical writings edited by Ulrike Edtke and Camilla Warnke in conjunction with Karl Benner. Volume 1, On the Philosophical Foundations. Volume 2, On Philosophical Questions of Economics in Society. And Volume 3, On Philosophical Questions of the Natural Sciences, on the History of Philosophy. Volume 4, Peter Rubin and Camilla Warnke, on Philosophical Thinking in the GDR. Back to the text. Instead, the New Marx reading addresses problems about the method and object of the critique of political economy, a task already identified by Horkheimer in his 1937 essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel, as a prime example of critical social analysis, although it was not systematically followed through by him or his colleagues. Reichelt thus states in his dissertation, quote, that critical theory to date has contributed nothing essential to elucidating the dialectic in Capital, the book, end quote. And it is, quote, characteristic of critical theory that, quote, critical theory is only able to formulate dialectical theory as a program and, at the same time, assumes a standpoint in the material investigation of capitalist society and also in the reception of Marx's later work, which Marx criticized as a positivism unclear to itself, end quote. Reichelt, 1973. At the same time, however, Reichelt and Backhaus drew on a whole range of ideas from Adorno as guiding principles for their reconstruction of Marx's understanding of the object of economy. First, there is Adorno's identification of economic objectivity as, quote, conceptuality holding sway in reality itself, end quote, of, quote, exchange value, end quote, as, quote, merely thought, end quote, and Adorno's associated diagnosis of the, quote, domination of the universal over the particular, end quote. Adorno. Also in this context stands the theory of real abstraction by Alfred Sohn Reichelt, with whom Reichelt collaborated in Bremen, according to his own account. These themes carry on for Reichelt into his later theory of validity, which seeks to decipher value as, quote, a thing, thought, end quote. Bracket, Gedankending, end bracket. Second, Adorno's idea of a, quote, inverted form of the primacy of objectivity, end quote, returns to Reichelt's theory of the predominance of objectivity. Adorno's idea of a, quote, inverted form of the primacy of objectivity, end quote, returns to Reichelt's theory of the predominance of objectivity and signifies the real independence of capitalist society in relation to the intentions and needs of the actors. Third is the critique of methodological individualism and objectivism in social theory. According to Adorno, the real independence of the capitalist economy cannot be made transparent to the intentions of the actors in a, quote, social nominalist, end quote, way, but neither is the capitalist economy, the real independence of the capitalist economy, and in itself, which exists independently of the actions of the individual. Fourth, there is the critique of, quote, positivism as a naive empiricist methodology which ignores the historical social mediation of, quote, facts and inverts, quote, the mediated into something immediate, end quote. This lineage from Adorno through Alfred Schmidt to Reichelt and Backhaus is not mentioned at all in the classical views of the Frankfurt School, such as those by Martin J., Rolf Wigerhaus, or even the more recent works of on the development of the Frankfurt School, like that of Alex Demirovich. On the other hand, however, there is a tendency among Backhaus and Reichelt themselves, as well as both their pupils and critics, to equate the new Marx reading in West Germany with the contributions of the late Frankfurt School. Footnote: Reichelt suggests that the new Marx reading is a pure, quote, Frankfurt product, end quote, due to Hans-Georg Backhaus's accidental discovery of the first edition of Capital in a Frankfurt student center in 1963. Backhaus, trained in Adorno's social theory, recognized at first glance the crucial differences between the first and second editions and laid the foundations for the efforts of critical reconstruction. However, in my view, this is unacceptable reduction of the sources of the new Marx reading. End footnote. New section. On the logical structure of the concept of capital. Beginnings of the West German New Marx reading, 1970. Helmut Reichelt describes in retrospect his investigation into the logical structure of the concept of capital in Marx as the, quote, first attempt at a reconstruction of ... the dialectical method in Capital, end quote. Reichelt. In the following, I present the fundamental theses of his work alongside criticisms of it within the West German debate. New section, on the continuity of the critical genetic method. Reichelt identifies substantial evidence in Marx's early work of the methodological concept of the critique of economy, whose social theoretical complements content can be, quote, deciphered only against the background of the late work, end quote. Reichelt. Reichelt's main thesis is that Marx's analysis of value should be understood as the, quote, fulfillment of the program of the fourth thesis on Feuerbach at the level of political economy, end quote. Reichelt. Footnote. Bachhaus draws attention to the fact that Marx, as early as 1843, in the course of his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, stressed the critical genetic method. Quote, so the truly philosophical criticism of the present state constitution not only shows up contradictions as existing, it explains them, it comprehends their genesis, their necessity, end quote. Marx, 1843. End footnote. What Feuerbach practiced in his critique of religion, the dissolution of the apparent independence and substantiality of God through his analytic reduction to the unified but unhistorically understood essence of man, is found in the political economy of Smith and Ricardo as the reduction of the independent forms of wealth to the uniform but unhistorically understood principle of human labor. Footnote. Later, Reichelt also emphasized some parallels between Feuerbach and Marx himself, the latter conceived of money in an analogous way to Feuerbach's concept of God, as a sensual individualization of a universal and as an alienated form of social interaction through an independent third. End footnote. Marx's project was to carry out a genetic reconstruction of the necessity of these independent forms and these independent forms' objective appearance from historically specific social conditions of labor. Reichelt thus makes an implicit parallel of the theoretical difference between Marx and Feuerbach and that between Marx and Ricardo. Footnote. Bachhaus also pointed out these parallels and even modified the fourth thesis on Feuerbach in a manner critical of Ricardo. Quote, Ricardo starts from the fact of economic self-alienation, of the doubling of the product into a value thing, an imagined and an actual thing. Ricardo's theory consists in dissolving value into labor. Ricardo overlooks that the main thing still remains to be done, namely, the fact that the product contrasts itself with itself and fixes the product self as an autonomous realm of economic categories beyond consciousness is only to be explained precisely from the self-distortion, Selbstzerrissenheit, and the self-contradiction of social labor. This must be understood in its contradiction and then be practically revolutionized by the abolition of the contradiction, end quote. Bachhaus, 1980, end footnote. The characteristic doubling in capitalism of the product into use value and value, of the commodity into commodity and money, of bourgeois society into society and the state, and so on, should be understood from the, quote, intrinsic contradictoriness, end quote, of the, quote, secular basis, end quote. Already in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx's first attempt at a systematic explanation of the fundamental forms of alienation in bourgeois society, Marx criticizes the central failure of political economy, in that political economy does not derive the genesis of the forms of wealth and coercion from the structural contradictions of this society. Instead, political economy starts, quote, with the fact of private property, end quote, without explaining the fact of private property, thus assuming what political economy first has to develop. In this, quote, standpoint of the finished phenomena, end quote, which Marx later accused of, quote, economistic one-sidedness, end quote, the alienated mechanisms of reproduction in bourgeois society are therefore uncritically accepted as, quote, final, no longer derivable, end quote, and thus no longer conceived as historical social forms. According to Reichelt, Marx criticized the, quote, positivism, empiricism of political economy at the programmatic level in his early writings. In the value theory of the later period, Marx overcomes this, quote, external grasping procedure of the bourgeois subject, end quote, insofar as no category, no category is introduced which is not completely legitimized, end quote. Reichelt. For Reichelt, Marx's, quote, positive science, end quote, understood as, quote, the first unadulterated knowledge, not performed through what can be known of social reality, end quote, presents itself as a critique of positivism in a double sense. The, quote, positivism of the bourgeois condition consists not only in the apparent naturalness of economic objectivity, but also in the real independence of social relations in the form of the domination of economic objects over the human beings who have, under specific conditions, produced them. However, Marx's theory can only reconstruct the process of constitution of this, quote, predominance of social objectivity, end quote, Reichelt, from the historically generated perspective of unalienated socialization. Only modern productive forces, therefore, create the conditions for overcoming the inversion of subject and object, and form the historical philosophical anchor of Marx's science. In 1971, Project Class Analysis, PKA, criticized this position. The outlines of a definition for an emancipated society become recognizable only at the end of Marx's process of inquiry. Before Reichelt's presupposed anticipation of this condition can acquire any determinate content, the social causes, structures, and conditions of the possible abolition of, quote, alienation must be clarified. The emancipation of communism, therefore, quote, does not enter, quote, into the theoretical penetration, end quote, but only into the presentation, end quote, of the capitalist mode of production. Erlich Müller introduced the opposite approach in 1974. Sorry, I've got to find this guy. There's a lot of Erlich Müllers in Germany, apparently. Let's see. Okay, it looks like I think I found him. Ulrich Müller is a German author of philosophical texts born in 1956. In his dissertation, quote, called Critique of Knowledge and Negative Metaphysics from 1988, a comprehensive interpretation of the philosophy of Theodor W. Adorno, Müller finds, essentially for his philosophical position, the method of a critical hermeneutic constructivism following Immanuel Kant. A first phase of work deals with aesthetic themes, in particular art and rationality. From 2001, develops general value criteria for artistic products. The philosophy of the Enlightenment philosopher Kant remains the main reference point for Müller's second ethical phase of work. It begins with the 2013 monograph, Peace and Freedom, which updates Kant's moral philosophy and its, quote, categorical imperative, end quote, in a socio-political sense, and concretizes it with a, quote, social imperative, end quote. The ethics is followed in 2017 by legal philosophy, quote, Nathan's Tree, end quote, which in turn modifies and differentiates the newly acquired moral principle. In both reason-oriented works, the evaluative double principle of freedom of peace, or also freedom peace, plays a certain justification role. A peace-free overall practice also describes the overarching goal of the epistemology and science theory, published in 2021, Peace-Free Knowledge and Science. In it, Müller justifies the basic functions of our cognitive self-realization in the world. The relationship between philosophy and neuroscience serves as a guideline for this, illustrated by numerous scenes from novels. I hope this is the person, at least. Back to the text. In a way typical of the times, Müller accuses Reichelt of, quote, not referring to any class standpoint, end quote, but rather to an anticipated human subject and thus indulging in a, quote, philanthropic alienation lament, end quote, which is due to the placement of his work within the, quote, transitional phase of the student movement from the positions of the Frankfurt School and Marcuse to Marxism, end quote. Yeah, I don't think it was the same Müller. I'm not sure, but it seems early. He would have been 18 writing that. That doesn't seem to work out in my mind. Anyway. Whereas Reichelt claims a strong continuity between the theses on Feuerbach and Marx's later work, Michael Heinrich radically calls this into question. In 1845 to 46, accordingly, Marx and Engels replace the abstractions of Feuerbach's, quote, human essence, and Stirner's, quote, unique one, end quote, with, quote, real individuals, end quote, and their historical economic relations as, quote, empirically confirmable, end quote, presuppositions of a materialist theory of society. This materialism, however, is empiricist. The, quote, practice, end quote, from which all independent and mystified entities are derived, according to theses on Feuerbach, is, quote, nothing more than an empty formula, end quote. Heinrich. It was only in the course of the so-called epistemological break of 1857 that the understanding of the method and object relevant to the critique of political economy really emerged. Quote, practice moved from the explanans to the explanandum in a strategy of presentation divided into structure, action, and function. The actions of the commodity owners were now understood on the basis of the gradually unfolding structure of the mode of production and were, quote, no longer the transparent reason for explanation, end quote. Heinrich. In departure from empiricist methodology, cognition is grasped as the conceptual reproduction of the object rising from the abstract to the concrete. With this, Marx first explicitly recognizes the necessity of a, quote, non-empirical level of theory, end quote, due to the existence of real abstractions as the object of theory. Heinrich's remarks are surely correct as a warning against the empiricist, quote, praxeological, end quote, shortcomings of the theses on Feuerbach and value form analysis. However, Heinrich ignores every reference to historical structural categories in the German ideology, such as the concept of the, quote, mode of production, end quote, which encourages Reichelt to see, quote, no naive empiricism, end quote, at work here. Footnote. See also Arndt, not Arendt, Arndt, 1985, which emphasizes that in the German ideology, reality is regarded as a, quote, context of mediation, end quote, as a, quote, structure of the relations which escape the immediacy of an intuitive understanding, end quote. Arndt, 1985. End footnote. It is also significant that Heinrich does not consider the fourth thesis on Feuerbach, upon which Reichelt essentially bases his claim of the continuity of the critical genetic method. At the least, he would have been attentive to the salient parallels with capital, which can hardly be dismissed. Footnote. See also Marx, 1967/72, quote, it is in reality much easier to discover by analysis the earthly core of the misty creations of religion than conversely it is to develop from the actual relations of life the corresponding celestial forms of those relations. The latter method is the only materialistic and therefore the only scientific one, end quote. Marx. End footnote. From the standpoint of an analytical theory of science, Christoph Hellberger in 1974 criticized Reichelt's elaboration of Marx's critique of economic empiricism. Reichelt's objection to a merely empirical approach, instead of as a complete legitimation or explanation of economic categories, is initially understood as a reproach against bourgeois science, insofar as it is unable to supply, quote, historical genetic explanations, end quote. Hellberger. The object of the, quote, logical analysis, end quote, unnoticed by Christoph Hellberger and first postulated by Reichelt, is the systematic re/production of determinate forms of wealth under given, but at the same time historically specific, social conditions of labor. Reichelt's accusation, therefore, consists neither in the assumption of a supposed, quote, bourgeois inability to make historical explanations, nor in assuming the inability to make causal analyses of social facts in general. Marx's anti-empiricism is, according to Reichelt, a critique of political economy, not a statement in the philosophy of science about, quote, bourgeois and, quote, thought per se, for failing to take into account the difference between theoretical and empirical concepts, and ultimately for succumbing to the object-induced semblance of the naturalness of historically specific relations. I heard ya. The structural analytic explanation of political economy is therefore not pushed far enough. Incomplete abstractions. The empirical and theoretical are confounded. False abstraction or lack of an intermediary between the theoretical level and the empirical level. And, finally, the historicity of the object is missing. Economic one-sidedness. One second. This breakdown and explanation, or the fact that these explanatory approaches remain within the framework of specific, uncritically presupposed categories, is not a problem of the arbitrary, quote, selection of questions, end quote, from which Hellberger derives the differences between, quote, bourgeois and Marxist approaches, but is materially grounded. The object leads the scientific observer to certain evidential assumptions about the non-history of the capitalist mode of production. This epistemological dimension of the material analysis in Capital, however, does not occur to Hellberger. Hellberger's positivistic conception of ideology stems from the deviation of, quote, subjective ideas, from actual reality, end quote, and the blurring of descriptive statements with normative expectations. Hellberger sees another possible interpretation of Reichelt's critique of the empirical assumption of categories in the idea of, quote, of a, quote, complete explanation, end quote, i.e. the demand for an explanation of everything that can be explained. But neither Marx nor Reichelt pursue this goal, even though Reichelt may sound like this sometimes. In contrast to Hegel, Marx does not investigate an absolute system, but a finite system based on presuppositions which that system itself did not create, and which therefore cannot and must not be explained within the framework of the system. This is precisely what Marx calls the limits of dialectical presentation, which Reichelt repeatedly points out. New section. Critique of the rule of abstractions. According to Reichelt, it is the Grundrisse, with the Grundrisse's inner, quote, relations of economics and dialectics, end quote, that first opens up, quote, access to the real contents of Marx's economic critique, and thus also the logical structure of Capital, end quote, Reichelt. Even in his rather unphilosophical, quote, extremely sober language, end quote, Reichelt, there are traces of a second Hegel reception here, something already emphasized by Alfred Schmidt. This suggests that Marx's recourse to a dialectical sequence of categories as the expression of a, quote, compulsion from the object itself indicates a, quote, structural identity, end quote, between Hegel's notion of spirit and Marx's concept of capital. The rule of an abstractum, i.e., value, adopting various forms, i.e., the value forms, and reproducing itself therein, i.e., as the accumulation process of capital, is considered by Reichelt to be the objective foundation for the workability of dialectical presentation. Quote, it has validity only where a universal is asserted at the expense of the individual, end quote. In its idealist variant, it is the mystifying doubling of this real subject-object inversion. As materialist, it reflects upon itself as a historically limited, quote, method of recall, end quote. As Projektklasse Analyse, I think that's what PKA stands. I think that's how you say it. PKA pointed out in 1971, Reichelt reaches just a little beyond, quote, merely abstract references to parallels, end quote, between Hegel and Marx, as Roman Rozdolsky did before him. Ulrich Müller argues that Reichelt's Adorno-influenced critique of abstraction has a tendency to absolutize the critique of science, which is suggested through equivocations of the formula of the, quote, domination of the universal, end quote, and whose final consequence would be manifest irrationalism. Thus, in the manner of a romantic critique of the abstract also found in Adorno, Reichelt claims, quote, when individuals first come into their own and are no longer subsumed under one abstract universal produced by themselves in this form, then general statements become impossible. With the abolition of social objectivity, the abstract negation of real individuality, the object of all theory disappears, end quote. Helmut Reichelt. New section. Dialectic of value form. It is above all the reconstruction of the dialectical structure of value form analysis that distinguishes Reichelt's work from similar works of his time. Reichelt specifically draws attention to the program of value form analysis still clearly formulated in the first edition of Capital. In the first edition of Capital, Marx's point is, quote, to prove that the value form arises out of the value concept, end quote. Marx. What was regarded with suspicion by previous commentators as a, quote, merely, end quote, conceptual dialectic, to which a historical proof should be attached, is thus recognized as the real problem posed by Marx. The transition from value to value form, from the simple to the general form of value, and finally the money form presented as the conceptual unfolding of the existing necessary connection between commodity and money. The motor of presentation is the, quote, contradiction, between the universality of value, and the inadequate form of value's appearance, end quote. Reichelt. In the universal equivalent, according to Reichelt, not only does each commodity by that commodity's self distinguish that commodity's value from that commodity's use value, but all commodities do together. The value which is common to commodities, socially universal form, is actually expressed first here, namely, quote, simply, in a single commodity body, and homogeneously, in the same commodity body of another, end quote. Reichelt. Quote, the commodities are all qualitatively equated, all are expressed as the material of the same labor, and can now be compared quantitatively. Thus, if labor time in general should operate as the regulating law of production, then abstract human labor itself must exist alongside and outside all particular commodities in natural form, end quote. Reichelt. It is thus clear that, contrary to Engels, The, quote, law of value and, quote, commodity exchange, end quote, cannot be spoken of before the existence of money. The pre-monetary concept of the commodity has no empirical correlate. Reichelt also explains Marx's distinction between the, quote, analytical and, quote, real relationship of commodities to each other. Reichelt shows that within value form analysis, the commodity in the shape of the value form gains, quote, only a double existence in the head, end quote. The independent existence of abstract labor in the shape of a specific concretum here is only the result of a, quote, ideal doubling, end quote, on the part of the scientific observer. The, quote, real doubling, end quote, of the commodity into commodity and money is tracked in the chapter on the exchange process. Here the contradiction between use value and exchange value drives the conceptual analysis. Drives the conceptual analysis. This division is put into question by Dieter Wolff, who argues that Reichelt artificially separates the commodity immanent contradiction between use value and value from the contradiction between the value of the commodity in the relative form and the use value of the commodity in the equivalent form, and then assigns them incorrectly to the levels of presentation in chapters 1 and 2 of Capital. Reichelt finds the former contradiction only in the second chapter and the latter contradiction only in the first chapter. And Reichelt thinks that the second contradiction drives the independent expression of value. This assertion, however, presents a logical contradiction, for the commodity immanent contradiction is the basis for the distinction between the poles of value expression, and this is already the first form of solution for that. But it is only after this solution that Reichelt encounters a, quote, contradiction ... at all, end quote, at the level of the still insufficient objective expression of value. According to Wolff, the immanent contradiction, W1, as the basis of the simple form of value remains the foundation of the further expression of value, since these are only the developed forms of the simple ones. Nevertheless, they differ from that which drives the development of the value form. The contradiction of the simple value form no longer exists between the value and use value of the first commodity, which has just found its form of movement here, but rather, as Reichelt describes, it exists between the social universal character of the value of the social universal character of the value of the first commodity and the unsocial particular character of the use value of the second commodity. But only after contradiction 1 has been, quote, solved immanently does contradiction 2 arise externally, which Reichelt disregards. Footnote. Even Projektgruppe Entwicklung des Marxischen Systems, PM in 1973 recognized this. Quote, what Reichelt ... misses is that ... the value form is already based on the opposition between use value and value, end quote. So the latter cannot be first introduced after it. End footnote. One second, I want to look up Dieter Wolff, trying to... Wikipedia says Dieter Wolf was born in 1942. Dieter Wolf is a German academic author who, in research and publications, dealt with the connection between the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and the critique of political economy by Karl Marx. Life. Dieter Wolf attended the advanced secondary school in Laspa, I don't know, from 1961 studied mathematics, philosophy, sociology, German studies, and general and comparative literature in Freiburg and Breisgau, Paris, and Berlin. Dieter Wolf was initially a doctoral student of Peter Jandy until his death, and received his doctorate in 1980 at the Free University of Berlin in the Department of Philosophy and Social Sciences under Peter Furt and Sebastian Herkomer, with a thesis on Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Karl Marx. Wolf works as a freelance scientist, author, and software developer. Despite fundamental similarities, Wolf cannot be counted among the, quote, new Marx readings, but belongs to their discussion circle. Dieter Wolf contributed to the debate about the reconstruction of the dialectical representation, in particular about the, quote, dialectical contradiction and the, quote, method of ascending from the abstract to the concrete, end quote, practiced by Marx in his work Das Kapital. Dieter Wolf also critically examined several writings of the new Marx readings, for example, writings by Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, and Michael Heinrich. His publications include Hegel and Marx on the movement structure of the absolute spirit and capital, an investigation into the relationship between materialistic and idealistic dialectics, published in 1979. Hegel's Theory of Civil Society, a Materialist Critique, published in 1980. The Dialectical Contradiction in, quote, Capital, a contribution to Marx's Theory of Value, published in 2002. Commodity Circulation and Commodity Fetish, an investigation into the systematic connection between the first three chapters of Capital, published in 1986. Critical Theory and the Critique of Political Economy, on the confusion of the concept of value, Critique of Reichelt and Backhaus, a critical examination of the writings of Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt. And with Michael Zomer, Imaginary Meanings and Historical Limits of Knowledge, a critique of Cornelius Castoriadis, published in 2008. Parenthesis. At the same time, a contribution to the understanding of the critique of political economy, end parenthesis. Back to the text. New section. Simple circulation or simple commodity production. In the book On the Logical Structure, Reichelt distances himself from Engels' claim that Marx, in the first three chapters of Capital, traces the historically independent phase of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. Reichelt, like Rozdolsky before him, draws attention to Marx's definition of simple circulation, commodity, money, commodity, as a, quote, abstract sphere of the overall capitalist reproduction process. Only in capitalism, then, is commodity production the universal form of social metabolism. Simple circulation presupposes capitalist production relations. Simple circulation presupposes capitalist production relations. Therefore, the logical conceptual mode of presentation exhibits simple circulation as a moment of the production relations and destroys the harmonic semblance of, quote, the encounter between the free and equal individuals in the sphere of circulation, end quote. Reichelt, 1973. The dialectical entanglement of both levels furthermore implies a critique of the project of the laws of appropriation for commodity exchange, and the semblance of appropriation through labor produced by them, onto pre-capitalist social formations. Starting from this understanding of simple circulation as a level of abstraction in Marx's development of the concept, Reichelt argues that the transition from money to capital is, quote, carried out more smoothly, end quote, in the Grundrisse than in Capital, based on the deficiencies of the money form. Footnote. It's a footnote I missed. With this critique, Marx not only challenges Locke and Smith, but also implicitly Engels' model of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. This model also assumes the political economic construction of a, quote, undistorted effect of the law of value in pre-capitalist epoch, regards abstract labor as an empirical measure of value, and conceives money merely as a technical instrument to facilitate exchange. Next footnote. In fact, there is nothing else in Capital about transition. End footnote. See Heinrich, 1999. Marx's critique of the economy thus turns out to be a theory of the constitution of the forms of alienated socialization and its characteristic doubling in the shape of a logical conceptual explanation of material reproduction's independence from its real systematic context. Capital is, quote, self-perpetuating, end quote, value and process. Nevertheless, on the logical structure, the book remains captive to Engels' historicist methodological orthodoxy, thereby obscuring the above-mentioned insights. Reichelt speaks diffusely of a, quote, peculiar intertwining of the historically descriptive and immanent genetic method, end quote. Reichelt, assigning a historical empirical correlate to the logical transition from the undeveloped to the general form of value, thus conceding the correctness of Engels' historicizing methodological reflection, if only, quote, approximately, end quote. As Bader et al. Criticized in 1975, this confuses Marx's talk of the, quote, real movement through which capital comes into being, end quote, with a historical process. As the Projektklasse-Analyse noted in 1971, Reichelt ultimately falls back into a logical historical parallelism in which the unfolding of the categories in the critique of economy is to be understood as the, quote, abstract form of presentation of that process which historically leads to capitalism, end quote. Reichelt. Footnote. W.F. Haug thanks him later with a positive mention. See Haug, 2004. Characteristic of Reichelt's ambiguity with respect to the mode of presentation in his, quote, peculiar, end quote, contradictory mixing of logical and historical elements, he points to a passage in Capital where Marx emphasizes that one must assume a phase of, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, preceding capitalism. In which the contradiction of the capitalist form of the material reproduction process were first created, if one does not want to run into the vicious circle of saying that capital originally brought itself into the world. Alongside this reflection on the limits of the dialectical presentation of the movement of capital, however, Reichelt adds the claim that Marx in the Grundrisse describes the presupposition of capitalist production, the separation of direct producers from the means of production, quote, as also a result of the movement of capital, end quote. It is unclear what capital he is talking about here. Peter Römer has therefore rightly pointed out that Reichelt's thesis, taken literally, entails the belief in a, quote, mystical self-generation, end quote, of capital. Footnote. Römer, 1978, and Ulrich Müller also sees an idealistic tendency in Reichelt's work, which takes, quote, the automatic subject qualities, bracket, of capital, end bracket, at face value, end quote. Wikipedia says Peter Römer, born in 1936. Peter Römer is a German political scientist and lawyer. Peter Römer studied law and political science in Berlin, Göttingen, and Marburg from 1956 to 1960. As a student and assistant to Wolfgang Abendroth, Peter Römer is considered to be part of the Marburg School. In 1964, Peter Römer received his doctorate in Marburg with a thesis on the criminal law problem of bribery of members of parliament. From 1966 to 1970, Peter Römer worked as Abendroth's research assistant. From 1972 to 1998, Peter Römer was professor of political science at the Department of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the Philipps University of Marburg. Peter Römer was co-founder and co-editor of the journal Demokratie und Recht, which was published from 1973 to 1993. In 1968, he was one of the founding members of the journal Kritische Justiz. His writings include, as editor, The Struggle for the Basic Law, on the Political Significance of Constitutional Interpretation, published in 1977, Origin, Legal Form, and Function of Capitalist Private Property, published in 1978, In the Name of Basic Law, A Polemic for Democracy, published in 1989, Capitalist Private Law, published in 2009, The Law of Society in the Federal Republic of Germany, published in 2009, The Defense of the Basic Law, published in 2009, Wolfgang Abendroth, Carl Schmitt, published in 2009, and Hans Kelsen, published in 2009. Back to the text. The only explicit critique of Engels in his book comes in the following context. Engels interprets Marx's remarks on the transformation of the laws of appropriation as a historical presentation of the emergence of the capitalist mode of production from the laws of simple commodity production without any direct violence. Since there's an italics in there, I'll repeat it. Engels interprets Marx's remarks on the transformation of the laws of appropriation as a historical presentation of the emergence of the capitalist mode of production from the laws of simple commodity production without any direct violence. Reichelt rightly criticizes this as a, quote, grotesque distortion, end quote, of Marx's ideas. But what Reichelt blames on Engels is not the historicist interpretation of the transformation. On the contrary, Reichelt reiterates his commitment to precisely this historicist interpretation. But only Reichelt's, quote, abstract opposition between violence and economic dynamics. But only Engels' quote, abstract opposition between violence and economic dynamics, end quote. Here, Reichelt once again confuses the fundamental difference between the constitutive violence of class relations as an external historicity, which in the chapter on so-called primitive accumulation, Marx clearly separates from the analysis of the movement of capitalism on capitalism's own basis, and the reproduction of the founding violence of separation of direct producers from the means of production through structural coercion as a, quote, contemporary, end quote, dynamic of the capitalist mode of production. This confusion happens because his only argument is that even in capitalism, labor power is compelled, quote, if necessary, with brutal violence, end quote, to produce surplus value. New section. On the critique of the philosophy of history, productive forces, and production relations. Marx and Engels' conception of history was also the subject of the Reconstruction debate in West Germany. Helmut Reichelt provided important contributions with his annotated text on the materialist conception of history, published in 1975, and especially Reichelt's essay on the dialectic of productive forces and production relations, attempts at a reconstruction, published in 1983. In these writings, Reichelt observes an ambivalent conceptualization of the relationship between productive forces and production relations in Marx. Accordingly, a causa sui, a concept of productive forces, stands immediately opposed to the analysis of the development of the productive forces as a result of the capital relation. Marx developed the first concept primarily in his early writings. Here, first, the productive forces, labor power and means of production, are regarded as an automatic universal historical motor of progress, which presuppose production relations, above all property ownership, is the merely reactive variable of social development. Marx, according to Reichelt, quote, postulates ... the determining function of the productive forces, end quote, as the, quote, basis of the ... entire history, end quote, of mankind. Footnote. The notion of causa sui concept of the productive forces stems from Reichelt, 1988. End footnote. Footnote. However, there are still also statements to the contrary, quote, till now the productive forces have been developed by virtue of this system of class antagonisms, end quote. Marx, 1847. End footnote. Back to the text. According to Marx and Engels, the character of the means of production itself determines the specific property relations or determines the specific property relations directly. Sumi. The character of the means of production itself suggests specific property relations or determines specific property relations directly. Quote, the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist, end quote, writes Marx in The Poverty of Philosophy of 1847. Second, according to Reichelt, Marx, before he even begins any historical research, expands his diagnosis of a present contradiction between productive forces and production relations to the developmental logic of universal history. The productive forces now bestow the unity of history, and their contradiction of the property relations determines the social progress of the mode of production. Quote, with the acquisition of new productive faculties, end quote. Reichelt quotes Marx, quote, man changes his mode of production, and with the mode of production he changes all the economic relations which were but the necessary relations of that particular mode of production, end quote. Marx. Third, the thesis formulated in the context of overcoming capitalist structures, that revolutionary change, quote, supposes the existence of all the productive forces which could be engendered in the bosom of the old society, end quote, eventually become hypostatized by Marx into a universal historical truth in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Footnote. quote, this is a quote from Marx, quote, no social formation is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and now superior relations of production, and new superior relations of production never replace older relations of production before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society, end quote. Marx. Reichelt understands this approach as heir to the bourgeois fetishistic evolutionary theories in which technology and, quote, knowledge are taken as autonomous factors of modernization. Ever since the Grundrisse, Marx had conceived of this, quote, inability to analytically separate the material side and the formal side and to reconstruct it in its complex unity, end quote. Reichelt, as the, quote, crude materialism of economists, end quote, who, quote, regard people's social relations of production and the determinations acquired by things, as natural properties of the things, end quote. They thus fall into a, quote, crude idealism, indeed a fetishism which ascribes to things social relations as determinations immanent to those things, and thus mystifies those things, end quote. Marx. Against the fetishizing of the historical process through a technicist idea of a, quote, basis of the base, end quote, Marx's mature economic critique shows, according to Reichelt, that the industrial mode of production is the result of capitalist production relations and does not precede capitalist production relations. The tendency to develop productive forces results, quote, from the competitive structures of capital reproduction, since individual capitals can only maintain themselves in a competitive situation if they secure advantages, end quote. Footnote. On this concept, see Weber. It posits the productive forces as the basis of the economic base. It was a fundamental ideologium of Marxism-Leninism, e.g. Walter Teixeira, who says, according to Marx, quote, the productive forces of society form the basis of production relations, end quote. Apparently the last quote that I read that says, the tendency to develop productive forces, quote, from the competitive structures of capital reproduction, since individual capitals can only maintain themselves in a competitive situation if they secure advantages, end quote. It says, the footnote says, Reichelt's Bremen colleague Heide Gerstenberger notes. With insights into the dynamics of relative surplus value production and its accompanying real subsumption of the labor process under capital, Reichelt sees a reversal of the correlation between productive forces and production relations. Since the Grundrisse, Marx had understood the industrial process of modernization as, quote, the self-induced movement of capital, end quote. Reichelt. Production relations now bring about corresponding productive forces and thus form the material side of the production process. Quote, in machinery, end quote, Reichelt cites Marx's Grundrisse, quote, objectified labor confronts living labor in the labor process itself as the power which dominates it, a power which, in terms of its form, as the appropriation of living labor, is capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The formal and material dimension to Marx should not be confused. But it remains an open question if Reichelt means something more than an external conceptualization of the difference between machinery in itself and machinery's capitalist application. It is unclear whether the productive forces, despite the productive forces' pre-formation, must be conceived as, quote, form-specific and form-transcending at the same time, end quote. In any case, it is certain that in the Grundrisse, quote, a theory of history is presented which cannot easily be reconciled with that of the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, end quote. Helmut Reichelt. Reichelt finds this diagnosed ambivalence again in Capital, even if the idea of the primacy of production relations, the conclusion that the, quote, explosive development of the productive forces, end quote, is due, quote, to the bed of infinity of capital and process, end quote, clearly prevails there. Thus, Tobias Reichelt notes that in Capital, Marx recognizes that only the, quote, technical basis, end quote, of capitalism is, quote, revolutionary, while all earlier modes of production were essentially conservative, end quote. And so no dynamic predominated then, let alone a self-dynamic of the productive forces. Footnote, quote, this is a quote from Marx, Capital, it is not the articles made, but the how they are made, and by what instruments that enables us to distinguish different economic epochs, end quote. And in a footnote, Marx praises the division of, quote, prehistory into, quote, the stone, the bronze, and iron ages, end quote. This is strongly reminiscent of some, quote, crude materialist, end quote, passages from the early period. On the other hand, there are such statements as, quote, the essential difference between the various economic forms of society, between, for instance, a society based on slave labor and one based on wage labor, lies only in the mode in which this surplus labor is in each case extracted from the actual producer, the laborer, end quote. Marx, Capital. But if one maintains a causa sui model of the productive forces, this leads to a, quote, aporia. Marx, quote, argues that pre-capitalist societies differed from capitalism in that those pre-capitalist societies, Marx, quote, argues that pre-capitalist societies differed from capitalism in that pre-capitalist societies were not based on the development of the productive forces, and just such a development of the productive forces necessarily lead to the dissolution of all previous forms of society, end quote. Reichelt. Reichelt's Bremen colleague, Heide Gerstenberger, I know who Heide Gerstenberger is, but I want to look her up on German Wikipedia anyway. She looks punk rock. Heide Gerstenberger is a political scientist and economist. Gerstenberger was a professor for theory of civil society and the state at University of Bremen from 1974 She became Professor Emeritus in 2005. Where am I? Oh, it says at the, oh wow. At the Historical Materialism Conference 2023, Heide Gerstenberger was awarded the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize for the English language version of her book, Market and Violence, The Functioning of Historical Capitalism. Her work focuses include, the work focuses section says, Heide Gerstenberger works on a broad spectrum of social theory and social history topics. These range from works on local social history to work on poverty and social policy to research on the functioning of National Socialist rule. The focus is consistently on the analysis of the historical development and current structures of modern states. Heide Gerstenberger is currently working on problems of globalization, different forms of capitalist societies, and processes of impoverishment on a global scale. Gerstenberger has also researched and published on the historical connection between the market and violence. Since 1992, Gerstenberger has also been involved in research into the historical and current practice of merchant shipping. Her publications include, it's quite a handful of them, but I'll read them anyway. The Violence in the History of the Budget, or The Power of Definition, published in 1995. Concerning Ship Service, published in 1994. The Craft of Seafaring in the Age of Industrialization, 1995. St. Peter Leadership Goal, with prayer and without schnapps, peace on board in times of upheaval. Ancien Regime in New World, elements of social and political formation in North America from 16th to the 18th century. What's an essay? ... that we knew nothing at all outside of what we ourselves experienced directly. 1996. Social History of Technology from the Art of Navigation to the Scientific Technical System of Astronavigation. 1996. All Clear in Poverty Policy? 1996. German in the boldest sense of the word. 1996. The Concept of, quote, total institution, end quote, in the Analysis of Seafaring. 1996. From Wind to Steam, Social History of German Merchant Shipping in the Age of Modernization. 1996. Edition of Bremer Freiheiten on the History and Present of the City-State of Bremen, 1997. My principles about Germanness and the various nationalities have become shaky like the teeth of an old man. Victor Klemperer in his relationship to Germany and the Germans. Published in the edited volume In the Heart of Darkness, Victor Klemperer as a chronicler of the Nazi era, published in 1997. At Sea, Maritime Industry on the North and Baltic Seas, published in 1999. Whole villages devoted themselves primarily to the seafaring profession, 1999. Disembedding, quote, disembedding or, quote, re-embedding, end quote. Or how current is Polanyi's analysis, quote, the Great Transformation, end quote, in the Festschrift for Jürg Hufschmid, 2000. That this and that from the new navigation is completely unnecessary in 200 Years of Maritime Training in Bremen, published in 2000. The Ship Community in Yearbook 1999 of the German Society for Shipping and Naval History, 2000. Subjectless Violence, which is translated as an impersonal power, History and Theory of the Bourgeois State, published in 2007, in English at least. I have that book, I need to read it. Market and Violence, The Functioning of Historical Capitalism, published in 2018. as editor with Claudia von Braunmühl and Ralph Patak and Christa Wisterreich, ABC of Global Disorder, from, quote, Anthropocene to, quote, Civil Society, with Erlich Velka, On the Waves of Seas and Powers, published in 2022, and State Powers, published in 2023. All right. Let's see, back to the text. Reichelt's Bremen colleague Heide Gerstenberger asked what conception of the unity of history remains after the universal historical hypothesis of early historical materialism turns out to be a residue from the philosophy of history. What happens when, quote, the question as to the historical causes what happens when the, quote, question as to the historical causes for the inauguration of a new historical formation, end quote, is no longer, quote, solved once and for all, end quote. Heide Gerstenberger. Since Marx's more mature theory, as Andreas Arndt observes, could no longer be a, quote, theory of history, end quote, historical continuity would only be, quote, produced through the development of labor, its means and its organization in the simple continuity of the generations. Labor, however, can neither be abstractly generalized nor considered the subject of history, end quote. Andreas Arndt. Wikipedia says Andreas Arndt was born in 1949. Andreas Arndt is a German philosopher and considered an expert in Hegel and Schleiermacher research. His works include Lenin, Politics and Philosophy, 1982, Karl Marx, Essay on the Connection of His Theory, published in 1985, Dialectics and Reflection, On the Reconstruction of the Concept of Reason, 1994, The Work of Philosophy, 2003, Immediacy, published in 2004, Classical German Philosophy After Kant, with Walter Jeschke, Friedrich Schleiermacher as Philosopher, published in 2013, History and the Consciousness of Freedom, on the Dialectic of Freedom in Hegel and Marx, The Reformation of the Revolution, Friedrich Schleiermacher in His Time, published in 2019, Freedom, 2019, Schleiermacher's Philosophy, 2021, The Matter of Logic, Concept and Reality in Hegel, published in 2023, and Hegel in Marx, Studies in Dialectical Critique and the Theory of Liberation, published in 2023. Back to the text. Where am I? I don't know. Since Marx's more mature theory, as Andreas Arndt observes, could no longer be a quote theory of history, historical continuity would only be, quote, produced through the development of labor, labor's means and labor's organizations in the simple continuity of generations, the generations. Labor, however, can neither be abstractly generalized nor considered the subject of history, end quote. Andreas Arndt. Beyond the assumption of suprahistorical laws of motion, as can be seen in the causa sui model of the productive forces, but also beyond the dissolution of history into a, quote, smorgasbord of arbitrarily arranged data, end quote. There remains, quote, a concept of social formations as the units in which history structures itself, i.e. transpires within a determinate context, end quote. Andreas Arndt. New section, The Validity Theory of Value, published in 2007. In his later work, The New Marx Reading and Related Essays, Reichelt declares that the reconstruction efforts of the 1970s failed. No longer must one contrast Marx with Marxism and reconstruct an authentic Marxian theory. Rather, Marx's critique of political economy itself demonstrates irreparable, quote, discrepancies and flaws already in the core theoretical arguments, end quote. Reichelt. Reichelt's project thus shifted towards a, quote, new, end quote, Marx reading, so to speak. To this end, he draws upon Adorno's intuition of a dialectical theory of society that renders discernible the emergence and independence, subjectivity and objectivity of the social. Quote, bourgeois social theory, on the other hand, does not develop an adequate concept of its object, but merely interprets different levels of experience found within capitalism. On the one hand, Reichelt diagnoses in methodological individualism the hypostatization of subjects' private dissociation into the primary, irreducible fact of the semblance of autonomy. On the other hand, he diagnoses in objectivism the hypostatization of experience with the independent dynamic of capital into a collective transcendentally presupposed entity. To avoid the classical dualism between theoretically constitutive individualism and collectivism, Reichelt now refers to another idea in Adorno, the interpretation of a specifically economic social objectivity as, quote, conceptuality holding sway in reality itself, end quote. To work through these unfulfilled aims of Adorno, Reichelt, like Bachhaus in 1978, turned to Jürgen Habermas's concept of reconstruction, the theoretical material at hand, above all the Marxist critique of economics, should be taken apart and reassembled in a new form in order to better achieve the goal it set itself. Habermas maintains Reichelt abandoned the debate on economic theoretical problems with his project to reconstruct historical materialism. Reichelt criticizes Habermas for replacing a genetic analysis of money as a form of wealth from certain production relations with a neoclassical and functionalist approach that conceptualizes money solely as a symbolic medium of generalized communication. Thereby, money is grasped linguistically and endowed by Habermas without any justification, with a capacity for symbolizing utility quantities. Moreover, Habermas artificially separates the idea of the money-mediated economy from the money-mediated economy's class-specific implications and thus turns out to be an ideologist of simple circulation. When the money medium is seen as a supposedly harmless means to facilitate the coordination of material reproduction, and relieve the risk of disagreement in linguistic negotiation, it can no longer be conceived as the independent, crisis-prone end of the capitalist economy, which entails exploitation. In so doing, Habermas misses the systemic character of the capitalist economy. Quote, Habermas, end quote, favored conceptual frameworks, quote, Habermas's favored conceptual framework for the economy, end quote, Reichelt concludes, quote, implies the romantic image of an exchange society of free and independent equals, end quote. The business of critical theory, end quote, Reichelt. The business of critical theory for Habermas thus lies merely in criticizing the, quote, colonization, end quote, of the sphere of norm-regulated socialization through the media of money, and to relegate it to its, quote, rightful, end quote, systematic domain. Reichelt, on the other hand, tries to solve the aporias of social science and economics simultaneously with the central problems of Marxist theory by linking economic phenomena with norm-regulated socialization in a completely different way. Reichelt assumes the task of clarifying the question of the ontological status of value and money within the framework of a new theory of validity, which he considers to be implicit in the first edition of Capital. In order to theorize value as an independent, quote, incomprehensible, end quote, social relationship, i.e., irreducible to the rational motives of individuals or groups, but also to denaturalize value. At the same time, Reichelt uses Adorno's terminology of value as objective, quote, conceptuality holding sway in reality itself, end quote. Adorno. Value is thus considered the result of a real abstraction generated in exchange but not reducible to conscious acts of abstraction by subjects. Reichelt now regards it as his task to explicate and concretize this concept of real abstraction, since it is only in this way that the specific social objectivities of value, money and capital, are scientifically knowable. Proceeding from this specific interpretation of the exchange abstraction as a theory of the, quote, objective concept, end quote, Reichelt begins constructing his premises by, quote, taking apart, end quote, and, quote, reassembling, end quote, Marx's theory. However, in decontextualizing and reframing Marx's quotations, which he does, Reichelt does not mean to reinterpret Marx's central theses. Rather, Reichelt presents this as the explication of Marx's own systematic intentions and concepts, albeit not yet formulated precisely enough. Three hermeneutical operations on Marx's text lead Reichelt to his conception of value as the product of an abstraction existing unconsciously in the head of the commodity owner. Footnote. Actually, two footnotes. Footnote 1. The concept of real abstraction comes from Alfred's own Reichelt, but Marx also speaks of real abstraction. What is meant is that commodities in the act of exchange are reduced to what is common to them to be products of social labor. End footnote. Next footnote. See first of all Backhaus and Reichelt, 1995. Quote, since value concerns a process of abstraction in which commodity owners and their heads participate, value can only be formed only in consciousness, end quote. Incidentally, in 1987, Robert Kurtz similarly presented the thesis of value as a thing of thought. Reichelt's theory of validity is largely a reformulation of Kurtz's approach. End footnote. First of all, Reichelt quotes from Marx's appendix on, quote, the value form in the first German edition of Capital, quote, equivalent means here only something equal in magnitude, both things having been silently reduced in our heads to the abstraction of value, end quote. Marx. I'm going to repeat that. Quote, equivalent means here only something equal in magnitude. Both things have been silently reduced in our heads to the abstraction value, end quote. The context of this statement and the presentation of Capital shows that Marx is speaking here about the analytical apprehension of value by scientific consciousness. The point is that the value magnitude of a commodity existing in the equivalent form is, quote, measurable, end quote, within the value relation, quote, only indirectly, end quote, by reversing the relation of polarity. That is to say, the polarity relation, quote, X commodity A is the value of Y commodity B, end quote, is also an equivalence relation. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, end quote. But the value of the relative form and the equivalent form cannot be expressed, quote, measured, end quote, in it at the same time, understood merely as a relation of equivalence, as in the later first and second subsections of the first chapter of Capital. The equality and magnitude of the two commodities holds only theoretically, quote, for us, end quote, in the head. The assertion is only about the theoretical presentability of the value of both commodities beyond the value form, and therefore, in contrast to Reichelt's interpretation, it does not contain a thesis about the supposed mental construction of value. A similar meaning also lies behind the formulation that value, in the later first and second subsection, is still merely a, quote, thing of thought, end quote. Since the real abstraction of value does not take place outside the exchange process, the specific social character of the, quote, individual, end quote, commodity, from the beginning of the presentation in Capital, can only be conceived of as a mental category. Value as such is only conceivable, not observable. Value as such is only conceivable, not observable. Reichelt now takes such statements as descriptions of the ontological status of value per se. Reichelt can thereby invoke Adorno when he writes that exchange value, compared to use value, is, quote, a mere thought, end quote, which, quote, dominates human needs and replaces them, end quote. Adorno. Second, Reichelt draws a distinction between economic form and the categories in which these forms are described. Marx's statement that, quote, the categories of bourgeois economy, end quote, consist in the objectively induced semblance of the material characteristics of direct exchangeability as, quote, objective forms of thought, end quote, is removed by Reichelt from the reference to the fetishistic semblance, bracket, shine, end bracket, that the forms produce in the expression of value, as well as to its treatment in the discourse of political economy. No longer are the, quote, perverted forms, end quote, described as mystified and fetishized real forms, but rather these forms are now considered to be objective forms of thought. Thus, Reichelt describes the objects of economy as, quote, categories, end quote, distancing himself from Marx's materialism, in which neither value nor money as economic forms are, quote, objective forms of thought, end quote. Only the mental reproduction of these forms in their finished material shape, which no longer exhibits the social processes of mediation of their production, are designated as such forms of thought. The revocation of the difference between object theoretical, quote, value is, and meta-theoretical reflections, quote, value is herein conceptually intelligible, end quote, as well as between form and fetish leads Reichelt to his validity theory, which, third, also leaves behind Marx's distinction between the levels of presentation of value form analysis and exchange analysis. Reichelt presents the constitution of economic objectivity as follows. Under social conditions of private, specialized labor, quote, due to the initially structured situation, end quote, commodity owners are, quote, compelled, end quote, to carry out a, quote, act of equating unaware to themselves, end quote, Reichelt, to produce value through a, quote, logically unconscious, end quote, movement of thought that occurs in the minds of all individuals independently of each other, thus presenting itself as a socially necessary nominal abstraction. Footnote, quote, nominal abstraction, end quote, means a, quote, generic concept nominalistically formed, end quote, through subjects' cognitive acts of abstraction. See Heinrich, 1999. Thus, in Marx's talk of the, quote, objective equalization of unequal quantities of labor forcibly brought about by the social process, end quote, Reichelt reads the fact that products of labor, in their capacity as indiscriminate products of labor, obtain the social function of being the ground of exchangeability, the socialization of products under conditions of private specialized labor, as cognitive performances of the actors. At first, this, quote, subjective, end quote, equalization of commodities, described in Form 2 of the value form analysis, is explained through a, quote, inversion, which also takes place in the minds of the actors before their social contact, as of the developed form of value to the general form and to the, quote, objective, end quote, equal positing of commodities. Value form analysis thus shows the, quote, change from subjective to objective, quote, form of thought, end quote, Reichelt. The genesis of money occurs through the combination of this unconscious production of the general equivalent and the conscious selection of the commodity fulfilling the equivalent function. Marx's concept of money should be distinguished from the technologically neutral theories of money as a, quote, cunningly devised means of information, end quote, by the fact that the, quote, universal acceptance, end quote, of money, which, quote, universalizes and standardizes, end quote, subjects' movement of thought, is tied back to the unconscious, quote, universal validity, end quote. For Reichelt, the explanation of the, quote, change, end quote, from subjective to objective cognitive activity separates this from subjectivist theorists. Dieter Wolff subjected this conception to a detailed critique, which Reichelt ignored in his later works. Although Reichelt ostensibly makes a distinction between the theoretical and actual relationships of commodities with each other, Reichelt puts into practice a mixture of both levels of abstraction. In so doing, the findings of the scientific consciousness are ascribed to the unconsciousness of the commodity owners. In the specifically social relation of things, in which they are placed involuntarily by people under certain social conditions of their labor, what happens in an extra-mental process, the equalization and presentation as values, is projected into the minds of the commodity owners. This transforms the genesis of economic activity. This transforms the genesis of economic objectivity from a materially mediated relation between human beings into a direct relation between human beings with respect to a thing. Even more, according to Reichelt, the production of a specifically social objectivity, value and general equivalent, precedes every social contact in the minds of each individual commodity owner, since, as he himself emphasizes, the actual relation of commodity owners first becomes the topic in the chapter on exchange. In this way, the socially valid form of value, the universal equivalent, emerges in pre-social acts of thought, and the actual relationship of commodity owners to each other is reduced to the conscious choice of a special money commodity. Footnote: a social universal, however, is not justifiable from individual subjective cognitive performances before their social contact. In addition, Marx can show that the various interests within the pre-monetary starting condition of exchange could generate as many universal equivalents as commodity owners, which would thus rule out the existence of an actually universal equivalent. See Wolff 2004, end footnote. In systematically abstracting from commodity owners, value form analysis shows that value is the formal nexus of social matter as products of labor, determining the agent's logic of action. Yet even there, Reichelt operates with the psychological acts of commodity owners. When the actual genesis of the universal equivalent and money should be explained by an unconscious social act in the second chapter, Reichelt limits the act to a conventional determination of the natural form of the already assumed as real equivalence function. Reichelt limits the act to a conventional determination of the natural form of the already assumed as real equivalence function. Thus, Reichelt not only picks up all the constitutive problems of social contract theories, he also remains in the dualism of matter and spirit and can only imagine objectively mediated social relations as pure ideas or norms. New section, conclusion. In this paper, I presented three main strands of Helmut Reichelt's work, as well as their critical reception in West Germany. Looking back over more than 40 years of theoretical work, it must be stressed that Reichelt carried through a move away from the economic abstinence of the classical representatives of critical theory. Reichelt retained, however, the young Hegelian social ontology of Adorno, which ultimately understood all social phenomena as things of thought and nurtured a skeptical relation to emergent social qualities, and systematized them in his contributions from the year 2000 onward. Historically, Reichelt's contributions to the individual strands of the West German Reconstruction debate were crucial. Footnote. There's a couple of footnotes, actually. According to Wolff, the unconsciousness is, quote, a non-knowledge about what is happening in the social relation of things, end quote. Wolff. So it is not an internal psychological process, but the act of human beings relating to each other through the inclusion of their products of labor. End footnote. Footnote. On Marx and Engels' critique of the young Hegelian social ontology, which conceptualizes all supra-individual entities only according to the model of religion as a, quote, thing of thought, end quote. See Marx, 1845-46. Quote, for the philosophers, relationship equals idea, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Reichelt also contributed 2 essays to the reconstruction of Marx's theory of the state in 1974. End footnote. With all their criticisms of Reichelt, especially with regards to his reconstruction of the mode of presentation in Marx's critique of economy and its object theoretical implication, researchers like Dieter Wolff, Helmut Brentel, and Michael Heinrich have been able to build up the new Marx reading. Reichelt's ideas have been carried forward in contemporary sociological theory, mainly by his students Christian Gershner, Lars Meyer, and Hanno Paul. End footnote. Where am I? Okay, so that's the end of the essay. So I'm just going to look up some things. So if you're done hearing me yak on, feel free to depart, as if you weren't free the entire time to depart. I'm not seeing anything for Helmut Brentel. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for Helmut Brentel. I don't see anything for Christian Gershner. Lars Meyer. And who's the last one? Hanno Paul. Hanno Paul, I see a link for him. at the School of Materialist Research. Doctor habilitation. Hanno Paul studied sociology at the University of Bremen from 1996 to 2001, and did his PhD at the University of Bielefeld from 2002 to 2007. Since then, Hanno Paul has worked at various universities in Germany, Jena, Bonn, Munich, and in Switzerland, Zurich, Lucerne. He is currently a member of the research group Society After Money, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, whose goal is to explore post-capitalist trajectories of common/commoning via agent-based modeling. Since 2013, Hanno Paul functions as Research Area Coordinator for Economic Sociology at the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. Hanno Paul's research focuses on the history and sociology of money, the history and sociology of knowledge and economics, and on socio-cultural evolution in general. His full texts are available at academia.edu. Yeah, I want to read more of some. I've read a chapter or two from that book, Society After Money. Sorry, I should probably wind up this video. Okay, well, I looked up those things, and I don't know if there's anything else neat to look up while I'm here. Just that Reichelt has some things in some of the journals that Werner Bonefeld has put out. Yeah, thanks for listening.